Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Lovely to be here on a beautiful sunny day. A bit warm, but there you go. It's beautiful. The trip down to Wollongong's always lovely. I always enjoy it, even if I did take the main highway. It's better along the beaches, but it's always a good trip. Don't know whether you remember, maybe I'm hoping for too much, but the last time I was here, we talked about one of the events in the life of King David. We talked about David's failure with Bathsheba, and in that story there's basically three characters. The characters were David himself and Bathsheba and Uriah. But we used that just as a bit of a springboard to try to bounce off and to go 15 years ahead to another character that didn't appear in the story and yet forms an intimate part of the story. And that was Bathsheba's grandfather. And his name was Ahithophel, and we saw that he harboured in his heart hatred for David because David had humiliated his granddaughter and he had never forgiven David for that. And when the chance arose that he could get his own back, he was just too happy to do it. So he joined forces with David's son Absalom to try to take over the kingdom. And hopefully we took a lesson away from that. The lesson that we took away is that God forgives, but people don't. As soon as Nathan pronounced to David the punishment for his sin, the death of the child, the fact that David would always have the sword at his side and would never ever live in peace, as soon as that was pronounced, Nathan also said, but the Lord has put this sin away. He's forgiven you for it. And then you read that beautiful psalm, Psalm 51, where you see a David that sometimes is hidden from us. David committed many sins. He made so many mistakes. I don't think any of us could count up how many mistakes he made. But there was in his heart an absolute understanding of the grace of God. And he was able to say, God, if it was sacrifices or burnt offerings you wanted, I'd give them. But that's not what you want. And he was able to see through the rituals of the law and to see what God really wanted with humans. But Ahithophel wasn't able to do that. So Ahithophel lived in a world of hate. And out of that we took the message away, hopefully, that it's up to us to forgive. We have to forgive. Whatever we might think has been done or whatever we perceive has been done to us, we must forgive, because it's only at the level that we forgive that we also will be forgiven. Today I want to talk about David again. You might think, surely there's someone else in the Old Testament. Yes, there is, but I'm sorry, there's a few more stories about David. And I want to have a look at two of David's loves that were lost. One of them was lost through no fault of David. He couldn't help it. It was lost through jealousy and through hatred. But the other one, he had a big hand in losing. And I want to have a look at those, just two of them today. And if you were asked, what do you think were the great loves in David's life? I'm sure you'd probably think immediately of Jonathan. That would be the first one probably most of us would think of. Then maybe Bathsheba. Then maybe Abigail. I don't want to talk about any of them. I want to talk about, first of all, the love between him and Saul. It's a love that we often pass over, but when Saul first met David, there seemed to be a connection. He met David, difficult to say which was the first occasion, but he met him also on the slaying of Goliath. That was the first time, possibly. And the second time was when David came to play the harp for him, when he was in a bad mood. On these occasions, David only 17 years old, and Saul loved him. And he said to Jesse, can he please come and live with me? Because, I love this boy. He's like my family. And after everything that happened after that, how that love fell to pieces, and that wasn't David's fault, it was through the jealousy of Saul that it fell to pieces. David had every right to be angry with Saul and had every right not to want to pass on a good memory of him. But it's not how David responded. If you have a look at, I think this is one of the most beautiful of David's psalms. I think maybe it's my pick. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 1. It's not in the book of Psalms. I've got it printed out here, so if you'd like to turn to it, you can, but I will just read it, and all of the quotes this morning I'll probably beat you because I've got them written down, but you can turn up to them if you like. But this is what David said of the man who tried to kill him, of the man who tried to hunt him down. 2 Samuel 1 verse 19, "Thy glory, O Israel, is slain upon the high places. How are the mighty fallen? Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you daintily in scarlet and put ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of battle? Jonathan lies slain upon the high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war are perished." It's a beautiful psalm, and it also encapsulates some of the story of Israel. I didn't read the line where in that psalm David says, Saul's shield lies not anointed with oil. And you might think to yourself, what has the anointing of a shield of oil got to do? Well, if you read through the other parts of the book of Samuel, you'll find that in most of the cases where Israel fighting the Philistines actually ruled them, and they prevented them from having any metalsmiths. Israel had very, very few metalsmiths. In the book of Judges, we're told that they had to go down to the Philistines to get their sickles and their ploughs sharpened because they had no metalsmiths themselves. And because they had no metalsmiths, they would often make their armour out of leather. And it's surprising, but a shield made of a number of layers of leather is just as good as metal, just as good. But what they had to do was rub it in oil. They had to keep the leather supple. They had to make sure, like boot polish we would do today, they had to rub it in oil, and Saul's shield was no longer rubbed with oil. It just lay there in the dirt. But it's a beautiful, beautiful poem that David wrote to the man who tried to kill him. Just imagine what David could have written. I'm going to give you the words of Samuel here in 1 Samuel 8. This is what Samuel said about the first king. "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, some to plough his ground and some to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and equipments for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks, etc., etc." All the things that a king would do, taking people for the service of himself. David could have said that. He could have said that this is what the king did, took people away from their own families to work for him, but he didn't. He said that they were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions, and how beautiful they were. And all of this that speaks of a relationship that Saul and David had with each other. 1 Samuel 16 verse 21, "And David came to Saul and entered his service. And Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armour-bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David remain in my service, for he's found favour in my sight." Saul loved him greatly. He loved him like a son. That was the start of the relationship. And he made him his armour-bearer. There is no more trusted position than an armour-bearer. The man who stands next to the king holding a sword has got to be trusted. And that's how Saul thought of David. And it was a beautiful relationship. It could have blossomed. It would have been lovely for Saul to actually see the relationship between his own son and his adopted son David blossom. But it didn't work out that way. Soon Saul became jealous. Soon the people began singing songs. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. and Saul became jealousy. What an evil thing jealousy is. It's something that can blight every relationship. But the relationship began to fall apart until Saul got to the point where he wanted to kill David. Wanted to pursue after him, to kill him, because he knew that he was chosen by God to be the next king, and that the people loved David more than they loved Saul. And so Saul chased him to the point where he was trying to kill him. And then we know the story on 2 occasions when Saul's men were asleep and David went in and took items next to Saul to show that he could have killed him, but chose not to. In the first time he took a spear and a jug of water. And David went back out again from the camp and he called out to Saul and said, "Look, why do you want to kill me? I could have killed you. I've got a spear here that was standing by you and a jug of water, and I've got them both." And here's what Saul says when he recognises that. Saul recognised David's voice, this is out of 1 Samuel 26, and said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And David said, "It is my voice, O king." Verse 21, then Saul says, "I have done wrong. Return, my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes today. Behold, I have played the fool and have erred exceedingly." Verse 25, Saul said to David, "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them." So David went his way and Saul returned to his place. Saul, after all that he had done, after all his efforts to kill David, called out and said, "David, my son." I don't think that was a trick. I don't think he was trying to say, "Oh, look, I'll call you my son and pretend everything's okay, so you'll come over and I'll kill you." He'd reverted back to the love that he'd had for David. He'd gone back to saying, "You are my son," like Jonathan. But it all fell to pieces. Not by David's doing. David was faithful, would not raise his hand against the king's anointed. And in Psalm 27, there's a slight clue to how David might have thought about Saul at the start. In Psalm 27, verse 9, we read, "Cast me not off, forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me up." Now, what did David mean by saying, "My father and my mother have forsaken me"? I don't know fully, but maybe there was this relationship where he felt adopted by Saul. He felt that it was in God's will that he moved into Saul's service. And there's this beautiful relationship which went bad. And why did it go bad? I think mostly jealousy. I think Saul was jealous of what David had achieved and also didn't want to see his dynasty pass. He wanted Jonathan to be the next king. The dynasty was extremely important to a king and he was not prepared to see that pass. And so there's a lesson we can take from that, but probably not nearly as much as the lesson we can take from the next one. The next relationship in David's life that went bad was with Michal. Michal was David's first wife, if you like the phrase, the wife of his youth. And everything went bad there, firstly, without David having any hand in it, but secondly, David had a big hand in it. And I'd like to trace through what David did that was so wrong with this woman. We read today the last story we have about Michal. We have her objecting to David dancing in front of the ark as it comes in, and she was making comments to him about how stupid he looked dancing in front of the Lord, and he put her in a place by saying, "It's God that I'm worshipping." And it all looks like Michal was wrong. From the start, when you read that, you sort of think, well, gee, she didn't understand worshipping the Lord. But you've got to add the rest before it. A lot went before that. And you'll see why she said those things. First of all, they loved each other. Michal and David loved each other. I think we've probably got more reference to Michal loving David than David loving Michal, but I take it that he loved her as well. What was not to love about David? I think you ask every woman, David had everything going for him, didn't he? He was handsome, he was a great soldier, he was a poet, he was a musician. I remember when I was a kid, I always wished I could play the guitar like the other boys. Musician, poet, of course the girls loved him. And in particular, Michal loved him, the king's daughter. Now Saul's daughter Michal, I'm reading from 1 Samuel 18. Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. Verse 28, when Saul realised the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David. And then in verse 26, when the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. David was happy about marrying Michal. The king was happy for Michal to marry David, not because by this stage he wanted David to be in his family. He wanted to kill David by this stage, but he thought this would give him an opportunity if he was married to his daughter. And so happy. First of all, Saul promised David his daughter Mirab, but that got sidetracked and she got married to another man. The second choice was Michal, and Saul said, well, you can have Michal, my daughter. So why did Saul think that was a good idea? Because he said to David, I won't ask a bride price for my daughter. Most people couldn't afford a king's daughter, I presume. He said, I won't ask a bride price, but I will ask the life of 100 Philistines. I want you to go down and kill 100 Philistines for me. And the Bible says clearly, this Saul said so that David might be killed. And so David went down with the power of God, not only killed 100, but killed 200 Philistines and brought back the tokens of their dismembership to put before Saul. So here's a love between David and Michal that started off with everything going right. Michal must have had a choice. She must have had the choice, who will I back? My dad or David? Same as Jonathan had the same choice. Will I back Saul or will I back David? Michal made that choice early. She backed her husband. She turned her back on her father and she dedicated herself to her husband. I'm reading from 1 Samuel 19. That night David made his escape. Saul sent men to David's house to kill him in the morning, but Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal let David down through a window and he fled and escaped. And Michal took an idol and laid it in the bed and covered it with a garment and put goat's hair at the head. Then Saul sent his men back to see David and told them, bring him up to me from his bed that I might kill him. But when the men entered, they saw the idol in the bed and at the head was the goat's hair. And then in verse 17, Saul said to Michal, why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he could escape? And Michal said, well, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? This is the story. Saul was in a rage. He wanted to kill David. So what did Michal do? She said, get out of here. Get down the window. Let me let you out. She chose between her father and her husband, and she chose her husband. She let him out. She put a dummy in the bed. So when the king's men came, they thought that it was David, and it wasn't. And then later, Saul said, why did you deceive me? And she knew she's in trouble. So she said, well, David said he'd kill me if I didn't deceive you, which was a lie, but she was still covering for David. She was still doing the right thing. All of this expresses her love. And she did put her life on the line. And you might think, well, saying no to your dad. Saying no to Saul was putting your life on the line. 1 Samuel 20 verse 32. Jonathan said to Saul, why should David be put to death? What has he done? And Saul hurled a spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that he intended to kill David. Saul was so enraged he hurled a spear at his own son, had his heir, had the very man he wanted to put on his throne after him. and he hurled a spear. What do you think he would have done to Michal, his daughter? Girls were not as important as boys in those days. She had her life on the line when she let David go. That's the love that they had between them. Then you go to 1 Samuel 25, and David has to run for his life, and now they separate. Michal and David separate for years. And in verse 39, I think it was 1 Samuel 25, wasn't it, that I referred there? Yeah, 1 Samuel 25. Years later, David's in the desert, and he sends to Abigail to become his wife, and so Abigail becomes his wife. And it tells us in verse 43 that David had also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, so they both became his wives. Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Paltiel, son of Laish, who was from Gallim. So David now has two more wives. Saul has given his first wife Michal to another man, to Paltiel. Why did Saul do that when she's still married to him? Because as far as Saul was concerned, David was as good as dead. As far as Saul was concerned, his daughter was now a widow. Because as soon as he gets to David, he's going to kill him. And there's no way David can keep running forever. So he married his daughter off to Paltiel. And by the way, when you read 2 Samuel 3, the war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. David in Hebron had married Ahinoam, Abigail, Maacah, Haggith, Abital and Eglah. David's now got 6 wives. Oh, and by the way, he's got all Saul's wives and concubines. I don't know how many wives Saul had or how many concubines, but God gave him them as well. So maybe he's got 18 or 20 wives and concubines now. Then finally, David is close to winning the battle. The commander of the battle is the civil war. There's a civil war now, because a lot of people flock to David as their new king, but a lot of people still support Saul, and so now there's a civil war in Israel. The commander of David's army is Joab, and the commander of Saul's army is Abner. But some of the people rat on Abner, some of the people accuse him of having had sex with one of Saul's concubines. And Abner says, that's a lie, I didn't do that. And Abner decided to change sides. And Abner sent a message to David saying, look, I'll bring all the men over to you. It's all Saul's army, all gone. You'll be the king, which is what happened. So Abner sent messages to David, 2 Samuel 3, verse 12. Good, said David, I will make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, the daughter of Saul, when you come to see me. Then David sent messages to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, saying, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself. So Ishbosheth gave orders and had her taken away from her husband Paltiel. Her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her, all the way to Barim. Then Abner said to him, go back home. And he went back home. I think we get the short version in the Bible. I'm pretty sure Abner said, go back home if you want to stay alive. But he went weeping after her. Paltiel and Michal were now a couple. They had now a family. They were together. So why David's now got 18 or 20 wives? Why did he demand that his first wife come? Well, he could claim legal. He could say, well, look, we were never divorced, so therefore she's still my wife. She was living with this man illegally. I suspect that wasn't the motive. I wonder what Jesus would have done. What do you reckon Jesus would have done with someone who was living with a man she wasn't married to? I think he would have said to her, go back and get your husband. And she would have said, I don't have a husband. And Jesus would have said, you're right to say that. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you've got now is not your own. Did he demand that she leave him? Did he say, I won't tell you the gospel until you walked out on this guy? No, he said, you look forward to Messiah. It's he who speaks to you. He proclaimed to her the first time he ever confessed his messiahship was to a Samaritan woman living with a man she wasn't married to. He made no demands on her. He brought salvation to her. David demanded that she give up a relationship which was working to be with him. Why? Because it was a shame for the king's wife to be living with another man. How could he be king of Israel and yet his wife is with another man? And I suspect that was the reason why David demanded and broke up that relationship between Michal and Paltiel. It meant nothing to him. We'll soon see later that Michal never had a relationship with him again, but he was not going to accept the fact that she was with another man. Then we come to the chapter we read today. The ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, watched from a window. When she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. I reckon she'd already despised him well before this. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me to be ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in your eyes, but by the slave girls you spoke of, I'll be held in honour. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children till the day of her death. Just think about Saul's answer. Her answer to her was, it was before the Lord who chose me before your family. Had Michal ever brought that up? Had Michal ever said to him, why didn't God pick one of my family? Michal had never brought that up. But David did. God chose me before your family. That puts her in a place. He was digging the knife in and twisting it. That was never in the conversation. And then the next thing. Let me just put this in a modern context. For every married couple here, or for any of us who have been married, just imagine you're having a tiff with your wife. And your wife's a bit angry at you. And you say, well, you mightn't like me, but all the girls at the office do. How's that going to work for you? You reckon that's going to fix it? That's what David did. He said, all those servant girls you're talking about, they all love me. That was another knife that he put into her, deliberately. Now, she was wrong. She was wrong in not recognising that he was dancing before the Lord. But just imagine for a moment how different the whole conversation could have been if when she had said those words to him, he took her aside and said, Michal, I love you. You are the wife of my youth. You are my first wife. But you must know that I love the Lord above all else. And I'm sorry if you were hurt. And I'm sorry if you felt slighted, but it's before God that I did this. And let's do it together, Michal. Let's hold hands and worship God together. But that's not what he did. he set about hurting her as much as he could. And then we find at the end, she has no children. Why? Did God curse her? No. They never had a sexual relationship again, which is pretty easy to understand. And so she never had children. Which is very sad, because that's a great shame on a woman in Israel. A woman in Israel felt fulfilled if she had a child. And there's just one verse I'd like to read at the end. This is a weird story, but I'll only take one verse out of it. We won't go through the whole story. 2 Samuel 21 verse 8, but the king took 2 sons of Rizpah, the son of Aiah, and she bare unto Saul, Ammoni, and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Melahite. And it says, the 5 sons of Michal. Now, that you'll find in some versions of the Bible. Often we look at our Bible and we think, well, that's God's word. There are so many manuscripts. There are multiple manuscripts, and we've got to make sense of them. Some manuscripts say that it was Michal had the 5 children. Some say it was Merab. And it's generally accepted that, in fact, that wasn't Michal, it was Merab's sons. That's Michal's older sister. Many of the Septuagint versions have Merab in there as well. And so I just mention that just in case you think it conflicts with the fact that Michal had no children. So where do we stand? As we come to the bread and the wine now, what do we say? It's no point having a history lesson unless we take a lesson away from it. We look at what David did. I think it was shameful what David did. He did so many things. But then when you read what he writes in the Psalms, I'm sure he must have regretted when he came later to have confronted his own sins. He must have looked back and realised the mistakes he made. Yes, Michal made a mistake too. She didn't understand David's relationship to God. But as I said, how different it would have been if he had only taken her aside and said, Michal, I love you. Come worship God with me. But he didn't. He tried everything he could to hurt her. One of the virtues in the New Testament that we are told about is kindness and tenderness. We often talk about love, which is the great cornerstone of the gospel, but kindness and tenderness are fundamental. Kindness is to be gentle to someone, not try to hurt them. How many times did Jesus have the chance to be sarcastic or whatever to those people who were following him? But he didn't. He put up with their stupidity at times and still gently guided them. And I come back to that one woman who was living with a man that was not her husband. And he proclaimed to her that he was the Messiah. And here on this table today, he proclaims that he's the Messiah again. And I'm sure he begs us to be kind and to be tender to one another, to be loving to one another.